But that said, over the last few years, DAs and cops and prosecutors have pushed to get away from this standard. And they have wanted to move to a per se standard, or in some cases, a zero tolerance per se standard. Many of you here, I'm sure, are very familiar with per se standards. After all, we have one for alcohol and driving. If you have a certain amount of alcohol in your blood, you are considered per se to be too impaired to drive. So why don't we have a similar standard like that for illicit drugs or marijuana? Well, there's actually several reasons. The most obvious reason is that according to the U.S. Department of Transportation, and that's in a report actually that I brought with me called State of Knowledge of Drug-Impaired Driving. It's actually a great report put out by NHTSA. It's online. A lot of gems, if you're doing this kind of litigation, are in this report. For instance, the acute effects of marijuana on driving dissipate in 1 hour. It's in this report. The U.S. government says that, not me. But this report also says that forensic toxicologists generally have failed to agree on specific per se levels that could be designated as evidence of impairment. That obviously is a problem if we're trying to talk about a set standard for per se laws regarding marijuana. There are some experts, and specifically there's a paper by Franjo Grotenherm that was published in the journal Addiction just a few months ago, that have suggested possible per se levels for cannabis. And these per se levels regard the amount of THC in a driver's blood. I work with Franjo on quite a number of issues. He's very knowledgeable on this issue. This is a paper that was authored by a number of experts, actually a who's who in individuals that deal with marijuana and driving. He recommends a standard of possibly 5 to 10 nanograms per milliliter of THC in the blood as a per se standard for impaired driving under the influence of marijuana. I tend to think that is a fairly fair standard when you look at the existing evidence, but this is very preliminary work. In fact, when I began giving this talk about 2 or 3 years ago, there were no papers published on potential per se standards. Now there's about 2 or 3. If we had a 5 to 10 nanogram per milliliter THC blood standard, this would exempt most recreational cannabis users who have not smoked in the past 2 to 3 hours. There's a very good paper that I brought with me by Marilyn Hustis. They give individuals marijuana. They then test their blood every 15 minutes to see what the THC levels are in their blood. They also look at metabolite levels in their blood. They do this for about 6 to 8 hours. We know almost minute by minute how these levels go up, how they go down, and how they correspond to whether those individuals are impaired or not. Marilyn Hustis has done terrific work in this area, and once again, if you're doing litigation on this subject, you need to be familiar with her work, because believe me, police officers will say things like, I can tell you with certainty that based on this person's blood THC levels, I can tell you the hour they last smoked. Absolutely no way you can't. Marilyn's work makes those people look like idiots when they try to get on the stand and say those things. There's a potential problem with the work of Hustis and some others. And that is when they are looking at the levels of THC and some of these metabolites, they are looking at infrequent, occasional users of marijuana. Most recently, a researcher from Germany and a team from NIDA began looking at, are these levels different when you have very heavy chronic users of marijuana? And in fact, the patterns of when these levels spike and how long it takes these levels to leave a person's system, they are in fact different, even for THC in the blood, which is not something people expected to see. So because of all this, experts do not recommend per se levels for cannabis metabolites in urine. They don't even recommend THC levels for the blood, because this science is still just emerging. And actually, I skipped over something I meant to ask. Are people here familiar with what a metabolite is? I put it on the screen twice there in one slide. A metabolite is essentially a byproduct. When you consume a substance like marijuana and that substance is metabolized. It then turns that substance into certain byproducts. The byproducts may be psychoactive, they may not be psychoactive. And most of the time when toxicology tests are done, they're not looking for the drug, they're oftentimes looking for the byproduct. So it's very important to distinguish between the active drug itself and the byproduct.